parlavo dell'inizio, ma siamo molto contenti di proseguire il nostro laboratorio e anche questa iniziativa si inserisce dentro il Festival Verona Europa. Io porto i saluti anche del consigliere Cona, che questa sera non poteva esserci, non so se poi arriverà magari per un saluto più tardi. In ogni caso, come ho detto anche ieri, siamo molto contenti come Centro Arendt di collaborare con il Comune, ma anche di aprire l'università a un pubblico anche non accademico. Queste sono iniziative che sono aperte a tutta la cittadinanza su temi molto rilevanti. Di nuovo ringrazio sempre Diana Bota e Cristina Jordan, che sono del Dipartimento di Lingue e Letterature Straniere, che hanno proposto anche questo incontro come quello dell'altro giorno sulla Crimea, anche questo con il professor Minakov. Come sapete, chi ha frequentato il mio corso, io sono molto, oltre che diciamo come cittadina, molto sensibile alla guerra che si sta svolgendo ormai da troppo tempo in Ucraina a causa dell'invasione russa. Mentre l'ambasciatore russo stappa bottiglie di champagne alla Biennale, continuano a cadere bombe sulle case, sulle scuole e uccidere persone civili. Quindi io personalmente qui anche mi esprimo in maniera molto negativa rispetto all'accoglienza e al trattamento che una nazione che ha diciamo, fatto un atto di guerra così esplicito sia invitata alla Biennale di Arte a Venezia. Comunque, now I will switch to English, and we are happy to have Professor Minakov here. He's a political philosopher who lives between Kyiv and Milan, and his themes of research are philosophy, political theory, and history of modernity. He is, I don't know if you still are, the guest professor at Europa Universität Viadrina, editor-in-chief of the journal Ideology and Politics, and he's also senior consultant of the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholars, Washington, D.C., and he's also editor of the blog Ukraine Focus of the Kennan Institute. He's published several books. One that I have started reading is called The Post-Soviet Human, but among his other publications we have From Servant to Leader, Chronicles of Ukraine under the Zelensky's Presidency, 2019-2024, published in 2025, and as I said, Post-Soviet Human, Philosophical Reflections on Post-Soviet History. So today we will have Professor Minakov giving a lecture on the, let's say, effects of this protracted war on Ukrainian society. So I think it is a very important topic, very useful for our students who are studying strategic studies in international security, and also interesting for all other guests. As I said, or as it was written on the leaflet, the lecture will be in English, and maybe during the debate, if somebody wants to ask questions in Italian, Professor Minakov speaks Italian, and so in the debate we can maybe continue in Italian. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for invitation, for your patience. We started a bit later. Well, while being presented, I have to say that my professorship at Viadrina is finished a month ago, and I am now a fellow at Leibniz Center for Contemporary History in Potsdam. Well, I will speak as a philosopher who from time to time must become a sociologist. That's connected with the fact that I'm empiricist in philosophy. So this is why I can make studies in political science or in social sciences. And that's connected with experience which we share and we can try to understand and measure. So where philosophy, political and social philosophy, overlaps with sociology is philosophy of understanding, verstehende Soziologie. I'm not sure what was the Italian translation.
Filosofia comprendente.
Sociologia
comprendente, scusa, sì.
So basically we try to understand what is going on deep there, which is very difficult to measure. It's not sondaggi, it's not entirely, like, positivist methods are rarely helpful in this. So for that reason we try to talk to those who know, those who are deep into the topic, or in English there's this expression, in the loop or in the thick of it. So in the matter, in these knots of social experience that only starts crystallizing. And this is why it is so important to start doing certain research on social structure of a country like Ukraine that lives in a long, protracted war. So imagine, since we are in Italy, imagine an attempt of some scholar, philosopher or sociologist in Italy in 1943 to understand what had happened with Italian society after the long war. So Italy was engaging in a number of military affairs in the 30s, then it was living in all 40s, the first years of 40s under bombardments, and Italy was divided. Part was occupied, part was still under the fascist regime. So basically, something that structurally reminds Ukraine today. Part of Ukraine is occupied, part lives in resistance. And then my research, this particular study, comes from anger. In January, I started reading the new sociological, freshly published books, and all we studied, sociologists, philosophers, who live abroad, who looks from outside, uses this buzzword of resistance or resilience.
Sorry.
Okay. Oh yeah, maybe that's one. Resilience. Well, partially it's correct. But this word kind of hides too much. There's definitely resilience, but there's so much more. And that was resilience in 22 and resilience in 26. Are they the same? So what is behind, what is happening with Ukrainian society? And then, when I tried to design the research, I had to select to whom to speak. So my idea was to speak to scholars in social sciences, political science, and in social philosophy who are seasoned, who have access to data which are rarely published, and most of data are not published in this period. And then those who advise to politicians. So usually these are directors of academic institutes in Ukraine, or professors who are heads of departments, so people like this. And another criteria to whom to speak and make interviews were that they stayed. So they live most of the time during the war, since 22. So in this selection, I also had to make reference points. So to two colleagues, one woman, one man, professors, scholars, who live outside of Ukraine all that period, so that I could compare. It's normal part of the design. Although the major interviewees that I invited were 9 men, 9 women, professors, heads of institutes or departments, who live in Ukraine all that time. In the first wave of interviews, I made 10 so far and analyzed in this presentation, and there will be 10 or more in the next months. My interviews were made via Zoom, and interviewees could have chosen either full anonymity or partial anonymity ought to be present. Most of my colloquiators were eager to be named, but still I will have to process it, so in this presentation I will still not name. I can just tell one or two names who were eager to be named, and just to explain the level of interviewees. Now, interviews were semi-structured. If you know how it works, you have like 3 to 5 basic questions, but when you start conversation, you send these questions to the interviewee while inviting. But then when you start interview, when you start conversation, you are drifted away. So you basically move somewhere else based on what your interviewee is answering or what is the message. Although as interviewer, my duty is to basically get data, information, wisdom, if you wish, of these people, according to all 5, so that in the end I could compare, so that in the end the analytical frame would work. But still, every interview is unique. They were based on Zoom. So I was talking using Zoom. Zoom now provides you with many opportunities, including transcription, which is also very important. It simplifies life of interviewers very much. And I basically asked 5 questions about the social structure, how it changed, about how solidarity functions. So resilience is basically the solidarity of a country or a society under war. Then how state is being regarded by population, and what were the cultural changes, and what is the long-term perspective that my colloquiators see. Basically, we have this deductive and inductive thematic coding here, but also, again, due to the nature of these people, you have access to certain wisdom. And these are wise people, they're not young, they have a long experience in academia, in political issues, in covering political issues, in understanding the societies, and they share the trauma, the pain, and also this solidarity that functions in Ukrainian society. They stayed there. I was somewhat puzzled that when I sent my 20 invitations for interviews, I received immediately 10 positive responses. 9 of them were men. And that was, for me, a puzzle. So female researchers would delay the answer, partially because women can travel, they can cross the border. Men stay within Ukraine. And later, when I started analyzing the data, I had to return to some of them and re-ask, what was the reason? Why did you answer in a minute after I sent you invitation, or within a day? And the answer was, we think, from what we see is published by our colleagues in the West, we think that they are not totally wrong, but mostly wrong. And second, they don't understand what's going on. And third, our voice is not heard. Men are rarely cross the border. Still that there are, you can see that international fora, there are men, sociologists, men, political scholars from Ukraine, but not that many as women. That's disbalance, but also an interesting, unexpected outcome from design itself. I never thought about that. I saw the difference, how we, those who live long time outside of Ukraine, have more and more wrong predictions. We make methodologically very well based predictions, prognoses, but they don't usually work. And that was for me some point of reflection. Why? So you could remember 3 days before the Kyiv will be captured in 22. Didn't work. And you could see that from year to another year, from year to year, we have more and more predictions that never get fulfilled. And that's possibly is connected with us being outside. So in the end, you can see that so far what I will report to you is based to wisdom from Kiev, from the capital of Ukraine, but also from those scholars who live in frontline cities. You can see that Kharkiv, it's a long term from the very first day of war, is a frontline city. Zaporizhia, it's my native city, which became a frontline city about a year ago. Odessa, again, from the very first day, it's a city that is being constantly bombarded, so in a way, it's a frontline city. And then, as a reference points, two scholars in Germany. Now, the first big and important finding is connected with the structural recomposition of Ukrainian society. So, in a way, my major message today is that whenever war is finished, Ukrainian society will not be the same as it was before 22. When you read many publications of 26, 25, made by very good scholars in social sciences, there's still this prejudice that there will be status quo antebellum. But it's probably not the case. Quantitatively and qualitatively, this society is going to be very different. So, what is going on with the social structure in Ukraine? We had a very big wave of Ukrainian scholars working on social structure after the dissolution of Soviet Union. So in 1990s, you could see social science, sociology in Ukraine, in post-Soviet countries, booming, because they had to understand what are these new entities, new societies. So suddenly you have rich and poor, for example. And post-Soviet human has to reinvent both richness and what it means to be rich, and poverty, what it means to be poor. As a Soviet child, I grew up in a society which was very egalitarian. It was bad to be rich. Yes, there were some richer kids in my school, in my class, but they would hide it. And there were poorer kids, and they would hide it. But still this middle class, the Soviet middle class, very strange and peculiar thing, it was very big. And then in 90s you suddenly see this pyramid. Slowly this post-Soviet Ukrainian middle class was returning into the picture, and we again had this Rome-like come rombo notation, this rombo-like structure when middle class was becoming big again. It was approximately in the years between 2002 and 2008. And of course, if you have middle class, then it means you have a drive for more freedom, autonomous citizen, and so on and so on. That was like the driving social force for democratization, for example. The early post-Soviet democratization is more connected with a small group of intellectuals, intelligentsia, and so on. In different countries, the number could be different, but the idea was to create free, liberal states with neoliberal economies, market-based, and so on. But these were visions of a small group of intelligentsia. They were not thinking what does it mean to be poor in these conditions. Even more, in the book I show it more that there was a cult of inequality. Inequality in early 90s was promoted as a value that there will be a group of people in economy, in politics, that will take the responsibility for development, for progress, and so on. So in a way, we already have an experience of studying social structure, and then we kind of lost it. Ukrainian, but most of post-Soviet sociologies, they became pollster studies. So they were polling. And it was a big business, as if your country, if your political system is still competitive, you need sondage, you need polls. But then all smart, good students, young PhD students would go into this business. And this verstehende Soziologie will start losing, the qualitative sociology will start losing cadres. And suddenly war have made a big difference. All these polls are, I will put it mildly, are highly trustworthy. So let's put it this way. They are more part of propaganda, more of like moral support for the population to fuel resilience and resistance and so on, but it's not like a mirror of what's going on in society. But then how do you study if you don't have polls? And polls are connected with openness of respondents. And this huge lack of respondents within Ukraine, it's partially connected with the trauma of the war. Since 2014, we see how increasing portion of people, of respondents, denying the answer. Ukrainians are usually, or were usually in pre-war period, very open. Ukrainians would actually want to say what they think. It reminds me Italians as well. So it's sometimes you want already your answer. Maybe we'll move on now. So in this setup, 2014 and the beginning of the war started changing the portion of respondents, but 22 changed it very much. And this is why these quantitative measurements are not very important anymore, unfortunately. They're still important. There's still Omnibus that Ukrainian Institute of Sociology of the Academy of Sciences does every year. And you still can see certain more or less valuable data, and you can use them in also interpretation for structure. But it's more and more important to use focus groups within on the territory and so on. But let's look at this big picture of what's going on since 2014 and more since 22. Basically, according to different sources, from 30 to 35% of population emigrated. The biggest wave is gone to the west, and you know, in Verona we also have thousands of Ukrainians living. But if you look at Poland and Germany, when it's close to a million of Ukrainians, there's also a portion who went eastwards, southwards, and there's also several millions of Ukrainians living on occupied territories. So it's the demographic loss for the government-controlled territories for Ukraine is huge. Then there's another element that we saw all the periods since the 90s, these declining birth rates. Actually, they started in 1980s, but the wartime period made the birth of a child a rare occasion. My first degree, my first education was in medicine, and I still have many connections, many friends. I was a village doctor myself, and when I talk to them, they say, oh, you know, it was already 2, 3, 4 years that in our village or in my medical work between several villages that I didn't have any laborers at all. And in villages from which Ukraine was growing mostly in the recent century, that's already a rare occasion. Again, these birth rates are critically in decline. It's when my colleague sociologists talk to young women who want to have children, the usual answer is, well, I will have children, but with delay. So it's delayed up until the peace is back, or when my husband returns from war, or when our family will reunite if a woman is outside, and so on and so on. So this delay is explained in many ways, but the existential, again, big picture result is a lack of births. And then youth. Young people are a very small portion already because of gradual decline of births in Ukraine, but with certain selection. So you know that men go to army, are called to the army on front that participates in the war. It's older than 25. Ukrainian mobilization is very specific and very unusual. It starts from 25, not 18, as like in vast majority of all military systems around the globe. And it lasts up until 60, not 45, as in 99% around the globe. So it's the biggest portion of men demographically are between 45 and 55, so that was partially the reason why to call. And these men were educated in Soviet schools where you studied some basic ways of military service. So in my school, I don't remember exactly, from the sixth year probably, we were like explained how to dismantle and make together this Kalashnikov, or how to hide during the battle, how to hide from nuclear explosion, and so on and so on. Certain survival techniques were there. So in a way, this returns right now into the curricula of schools, but this prepared population was in this age group. So basically, what we see today, very different, is lack of young men in Ukraine and certain type of convergence. So migration today is not anymore a short interruption. So when my colleagues were studying migrants in Poland, or migrants in Germany, or migrants in Sweden, Ukrainian migrants, the question would, or the answer would usually be, okay, we will wait when this war ends, and it will end in a month, in 6 months. So this migration was a short interruption of normality, of pre-war normality. This is not the case anymore. So migrants, the number of Ukrainian migrants who respond that we will return home at a certain moment after the war is declining. Since these are the studies made outside, the respondent rate is very high, so these are reliable polls. But there's also one issue that most of scholars who study Ukrainian migrants, they say that there's a certain preference. So if my city, if my territory, if my village is under Ukrainian government control, and there's the end of the war, there's a high probability that this person, this migrant, will return. However, if it's not, then there's a difference. So those who are ready to return is about 1/3 today. That's quite a low, and it's getting lower. And then when you look on Ukrainian population on government-controlled territories, it's basically aging population and fighting populations. In the fall of 2024, Ukrainian government, after work with Ukrainian demographers and economists, came up with a demographic strategy. It's the first time document that we've ever been created of this kind. And there, between the lines, you read that in future we will have a country that denies its pre-war structure. So if you remember Ukrainian map, like 65% of population would leave Kyiv, Kharkiv, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, Mariupol, Odessa, Dnipropetrovsk. So southeast, from north to east to south, big urban centers, million or near million, and in the west it's only Lviv area that was mostly populated. So the density is now very different. So movement, those internal migration, not outside, tends to go to central and western Ukraine. And in this demographic strategy, you see that the territories of western Ukraine have resource limits in water, in energy, and everything. So basically, we will have to create new economy, new infrastructure in order for people to be able to live there if most of the population would move westwards. Second, this will be an economy with elderly workers, so that the retirement pension will not be in place anymore, or will be symbolic, and workers will be 65 plus, men and women. It's very specific economic structure, or mass immigration of workers from the global south. There's also this regional labor restructuring, so more and more industry. 78 to 80% of Ukrainian production, heavy production complexes were in, again, southeast. It's not there anymore. Well, it still exists, but not at this level. And which means that Ukrainian industry, if it ever will be, it will be created anew and mainly in western Ukraine or central Ukraine. Then we have this middle class under pressure. It disappears again. Incomes of families are in decline, and behavior of Ukrainian population right now shows that middle class is declining or skomparso. That's it. Then the division, new classes, or better to say stratas. In Ukrainian and Russian we have this term soslovie verstva, which is strata, social strata, a group, a big social group with very specific relation to law. So there's no equality under law. Certain stratas have more rights, less rights, and you see how multi-strata society is emerging right now. For a very long time, Ukrainian development was connected with this universalist agenda of liberal democracy, citizenship for everyone. Now this stratification and is creation of a new society. And here we see early warning signals. Again, 4 years is not even under 4 years under protracted war is not enough to say that this structure is crystallized, has crystallized. It's in process of creation. But these early warning signals allow us to understand these nodes that concentrate forces, people, rights, privileges, disadvantages. So we have military as a new social class. Before 2022, we had approximately 1,100,000 Ukrainians, mainly men, who went through military system, and they were already having the identity with very specific mentality, expectations, political agenda. But since 2022, it's much bigger. So we can say that together with the families, with the close relatives, the so-called the war in Ukraine involves at least 5 million persons, men and women, fighting men, women in the rear, but sharing certain ideas, certain visions, certain privileges or disadvantages. And this military as a new social class, a military strata, is different by its income, by the way they consume services, goods. It's a different political ambition, which places military personnel within a wartime middle class. So if we have middle class, it's not these autonomous citizens with certain income that does not depend on government. It's now military class, disciplined, patriotic, its income depends on belonging to army or veteran organizations. So it's very specific new middle class. There's another very interesting change, another node that we see in its new bureaucracy. So Ukrainian bureaucracy was genetically connected to Soviet one, so it was very specific, rationalized group of people within society, and it's now tremendously changing. First of all, it's much smaller. Those categories, 7 categories in public service that we had, we would have predominantly male 2 first categories and predominantly female at the lower categories of bureaucracy. Now it's more and more like equal despite the wartime. Second, the behavior is different. These digital services are so developed in Ukraine, specifically in Ukraine under Zelensky and his team, but also the former guys from IT sector, so precarious but with high level of income, they moved in these 4 years into bureaucracy, and the old one moved out. I will not go deeper into this, but just explain that this happened. So now the former IT guys are bureaucrats now. They are defended then from mobilization, they participate in reforms or in services, provision of services, and so on. At the same time, proletariat, the old traditional proletariat, is disappearing. They are mainly brought to army. There's definitely the poorer you are, most definitely you will end up in the warring detachments or the parts of the army. And proletariat is fighting in Ukraine today. That's another node that we can see. And again, many of my interlocutors, especially men, they say that they start using these visits to drafting points, so the mobilization points. As a scholar, as a professor, you are not going to army, you are not going to be mobilized, but you have to go to drafting point from time to time, several times a year, in order to receive this document for continuation. And these queues in drafting points, the mobilization points, are like another set of focus groups. In these lines, in these queues, you see not only people that are called for mobilization, you see widows, you see veterans. You suddenly in the laboratory of Ukrainian society, in many cases, and they start doing their research in form of conversation with these people. And then you can see that this social observatory role in the mobilization points is like a specific place, which also says something about how you can make this outreach to society. Well, we see, of course, Ukraine as re-territorialized society. I just want to see if I'm not talking too much. So, 3 territorial zones we can say. The active combat war-traversed zone is basically 50-60 kilometers in length, around 30 and 30 around the front line. Then there are near-front border regions which are mainly populated with elder people, and deeper rear regions where you have this diversity of different classes and groups. And there's these key dynamics, 4 key dynamics that can describe Ukrainian society. Relocation, so within the country or going abroad. Deterritorialization, so loss of personal and institutional group cultural ties to the place of your origin. And social worlds erode even if buildings remain. So in Zaporizhia, again, you see a lot of buildings standing. Yes, these big bombs are now reaching the city. Still, architecture is there, but it's empty. People are leaving. And those groups who left, they already start losing ties, unlike in the beginning of the war. So these social worlds, small organic groups, they are disappearing en masse. Then Kiev's weakening role. The capital loses status as demographic accumulator. You know, as philosopher, I honestly believe that among the subjects of history, or the agents of history, cities or historical cities are. And if you look at Kiev, it was the actor in recent history of Ukraine. It was basically the only city that grew. It was taking all the energies, all the capitals, human and economic, into itself. It was very egoistic. Being former Kievite, I must confess, we were egoistic. We were taking everything outside of Ukraine. We exhausted Odessa intellectually. It used to be a very important cultural center. Dnipropetrovsk, now Dnipro was full of energy, of brain, of intellect, of engineers. We emptied it. The only big competitor remained Donetsk, that grew up constantly. Now it is destroyed in this war. And then we had Kharkiv as a constant, long-standing competitor to Kiev. And during independence, they kind of encapsulated trying to preserve their cultural capital, their human capital, but they failed as well. And this war ended Kharkiv as intellectual and cultural center. So, and Kiev remained like the sole actor in Ukraine, and now it also, this Kievite capital is gone or partially destroyed, and a lot of villagers are entering the city. This story of villager coming to big city repeats. And sociologists from Kiev were specifically mentioning that, oh, you know, quite often now you can have a taxi driver who doesn't know the city, and they will ask you where to go, just because he came from his small town or village several months ago. He still doesn't know the city. And it changes the lifestyles again, and so on and so on. It's quite unusual. And then we have this category that became class, IDPs, so internal migrants. They, the first millions of IDPs we had in 2014. And slowly, bureaucratically, but also without integration within local communities, they created their own class. These are new social worlds created, very independent and with their own vision of future, of survival techniques, and how to not to be integrated in a way. That was the social recomposition. Now let's look at another niveau and another field which is connected with solidarity and conflict. And here we can see how solidarity, that was both vertical and horizontal in 2022, is very different in 26. And it becomes more and more divided, or deepened. The division is deepened. So horizontal solidarity remains strong, but it's now strained by the width. So in 2022, if there's a house bombed in, let's say, Zaporizhia, in Kharkiv, or in Kiev, you can get support from equals, from volunteers from around Ukraine. There was no division, but now you have definitely this tendency that the locals will most probably help you. Because everywhere is the problem. The number of resources has reduced. The savings that Ukrainian families had in 22, they are exhausted by now. So we have strong horizontal solidarity, but it's strained. Volunteers, mutual aid, and community cooperation remain as a core social infrastructure. When you see the word resilience, this is the core of resilience. This is where it comes from. Then trust functions most effectively at this horizontal level. The moment you involve someone superior, distrust appears. And since 25, when these corruption cases are being registered, you can listen again, and you can have shock of how disgraceful is behavior of ruling group. Then this trust reacted immediately, so it became very horizontal. It's in a way returning to survival techniques of the 90s, with the new possibilities and technologies though. Then this increasingly resource-dependent solidarity. There's, I said, this financial exhaustion is in place, but there's also emotional depletion. We will talk about this a little bit later. And there's organizational situations. Those thousands of volunteer organizations from 22 disappeared. It's like tens of volunteer organizations. They became stronger, in many ways more efficient, but less. So in a way, horizontal solidarity is there, with specificity in it, but this core resilience is there. But vertical solidarity, there's a growing deficit. And again, corruption cases is one thing, but also veterans, when they return, they have their own experience of distrust to the higher level authorities within army or within civil service. But there's a widening asymmetry. So society sustains war through lateral ties, but elites now openly fail to demonstrate proportional sacrifice. So this sacrifice in small groups, the lower class you are, the more sacrifice you from your savings, from your life, from your resources, and the higher you are, the less you participate in this national case. Now, this is what the perception of inequality is being said. It is lows go fight, not highs. That's like a slogan. And as a result, high willingness to support survival coexists with deep mistrust toward institutional fairness. And it definitely translates into something like connected to the common case of statehood. But we'll talk about this a bit later. Right now, let's look at new groups as and cleavages, social cleavages in the society. So fighters, non-fighters, definitely the normal cleavage within society at war. Mobilized versus exempt, it's among male population. There's a growing differences. Stayers versus migrants. So there's a contempt against those who left. And it's not only in like more emotional social groups, but also among academicians. You can see immediately how the tension exists between professors in Ukraine and Ukrainian professors from outside. And this becomes structural. It's already crystallized in practices, institutions, decisions, instructions of academic institutions, and so on. There's also division between front and rear, resource rich and resource poor, and of course, veterans versus draft dodgers. If we assess, I mentioned you, this 5 million of warring Ukraine, there's between 3 to 4 million of draft dodgers, those who left army illegally, and their families. So they have their own subculture, they have their shadow economy, because they have to survive. These are the men who cannot show up formally outside, but they still exist, they work somehow, and so on and so on. So it's another like social world appearing there with their own ideology, song culture, social groups on internet, and so on and so on. I never thought about this, but after interviews I went and I found these Telegram channels, Facebook groups, some other groups where they communicate and what kind of information they share, what are the attitudes, ideologies, and how big the group is. Now, again, if these two types of solidarity is also different, definitely it becomes politically structured, outsourced. Now we have this repeated pattern, country versus state. I don't know if it existed in Italy, lo Stato contro il paese, but in Ukraine we have it like an old division. It was in 19th century, it was independent Ukraine, post-Soviet Ukraine, and now we see it's like a new division, a difference between state and country that for some time disappeared. In 2022, that was like again the united entity, and under the protracted war, these are two entities that are. So from interviews, but again, the sociologists, they rely on their own studies in focus groups or in their conversations, in their practical wisdom. So country is something warm, native, beautiful, worth dying for. And there's this effective belonging that does not depend on citizenship and so on. It's a shared life world. However, when you start talking about state, it's called pressuring, potentially deceptive. It was deceptive before the war, so Ukrainians were very anti-etatist en masse before 2014. But when the war started, state received the status of defender, of protector. So there was a new legitimacy, and the number of Ukrainians that started like having positive attitudes towards state started growing. And then again, this growth was very high. The peak was in 22, and by 26 you can say that it's in decline. So right now, this experience of change is expressed in the way, so state is still a defender, so everyday defender, but it's now this less effective relation, and it's a necessary evil. It's a coercive, extractive entity. So we have instrumental reliance, but not normative trust. It's a very new situation for Ukrainians at least. And there's a very low trust in institutional justice. Then Ukrainian citizenship before, let's say, before 2014 was a disadvantage. If you're a Ukrainian citizen, you will not have a visa to go abroad, most probably. Or you have you have to pay a lot of money and efforts in order to get this visa in comparison to all our neighbors in Eastern Europe. Now it's different. And Ukrainian passport, Ukrainian citizenship became a value. So that was something new. However, especially in 22. However, in 25-26, my interlocutors reported that rally effect around the state and around the citizenship weakened, and trust is now fragmented. So high confidence remains in military, for example, this part of state, but low trust in political institutions and broader state. So citizenship is still very valuable, state is necessary evil, but this legitimacy, effective especially, is being destroyed by reports on corruption, on unequal participation in sectors and so on. And then there's something else in it. So elasticity, that I use the term, but that's emotional change within a day, within hours, when you are like, have something happen politically and society is very highly reactive, and it was growing since 2014, since the start of Donbas war, occupation of parts of Ukraine, annexation of Crimea. So this emotionality, creativity is very high, and it's part of everyday life. And there are these shifts, very fast shifts from euphoria to dismay and back, within day, within hours. And within several weeks, society can live like this, in a healthy way. But this is something new. When you live from year to a year in such a changeable situation. So here politicians receive new ways of controlling society and managing it for their purposes. So far, due to war, we do not have active political life. But the moment political life returns, society that lived that long under effective influence and with minimum of political rationality is highly vulnerable for mismanagement from political class. Now let's move to moral orders. It's part of the social structure, so hierarchies and the look at a future. So today's new moral center of society, definitely military, so those who are actually defending Ukraine. Then volunteers who help military to defend Ukraine directly. Then medicians, doctors who work every day after bombing in the rear or at the front line, and communal workers, those who try to restore at least some semblance of normality after a bombing, after a fire, and so on. So there's like two major dynamics here, from heroism to responsibility, and this civic versus ethnocultural solidarity. In heroism, we see that language of heroism is shifting, so from exalted, exasperated, heroic unity to sober ethics of duty and endurance. That's a new way of understanding what it means to be hero. It's not one act anymore. Legitimacy is attached to sustained responsibility over time, not only extraordinary action. And then this civic versus ethnocultural solidarity is in tension, which is unresolved. The ethnocultural model gains more and more political validity right now. The civic political model fits European trajectory, but is not appreciated within. And then, if you live in a society under protracted war, these shifts from different effects during day, you live with war as part of your life now. However, it's interesting, it's one of the potentially very rich for theories, and I think for Arendtians that would be very interesting, this difference between routine and normality of war. So from my interviews, it's people, this wisdom that was delivered to me in my interviews, war did not become normal. You can actually see it also from the films produced in Ukraine during war. Literature is less susceptible to this, but at least this pop science shows war is still abnormal. However, it became routine. So this difference between routine and normality is key here. And it produces something that, well, two important, at least for me as philosopher, two important outcomes. First, deferred life. So I don't live right now, I survive, my family survives. We may be parted, we may live in different cities, but we will wait. We need to survive. So our normal life, our good life, our family life, our love, our children will be delayed. We will return to our life when war ends. And the second phenomenon is this shrinking future horizon. I was pressing my interviewees to answer what is future now for you, and how you understand its future for Ukrainians in Ukraine. And the answer is, oh, actually about future we can talk more or less clearly when the war ends. So now is becoming bigger and bigger, and future is like inaccessible. There's no convincing public picture of the future. And you can see right now that there are different groups in media, in mass media, less visible, that try to fight for the right to offer this vision of future. So this restoration of credible future, like common future, is very important for post-war situation. And now we were entering this situation of paradox of wartime recomposition. If we look at it, so the logic of the points of dynamics, we start with a war, which is connected with mobilization and loss, with creation of new moral hierarchy and new inequalities. So we went through it. And there's a conditional cohesion that we have. There's a huge potential risk for post-war transition. So you know that post-Soviet times, everything that was after 89, 91, were called and understood not only by scholars, but politicians, active citizens in Ukraine, in Belarus, in Moldova, in post-Soviet countries, as part of transition, post-communist transition. We were moving from one point, totalitarian, post-totalitarian Soviet society, to democratic, to liberal society, free society, and so on. Now this idea is forgotten, and in political philosophy we talk more and more about post-transition Europe, Eastern Europe, but even bigger picture. However, in Ukraine we will have transition. It will be post-war transition, which would normalize life in Ukraine. But this transition is vulnerable to those cleavages and traumas that we received during protracted war. The longer war goes on, the more risks for transition we have. So three decisive post-war tasks then. So when we look at this transition, it's not about freedom anymore. It's not about income anymore. What kind of economy with aged workers will you have? So first, recognition of equitable burden. So this transition, if we couldn't be more or less equitable during war, let's try to make transition more just, socially just afterwards. So we will have to translate wartime sacrifice into credible arrangements of justice and care. And second issue is credible institutional justice. Courts and execution of court decision must be restored. So far, what we saw since 2014, one of the negative outcomes of Europeanization was connected distrust to Ukrainian courts. For right and wrong reasons. But now we are moving to something that when justice should return in order to preserve the ability to transform the republic. And then restoration of shared future horizon. We have pockets of this delayed future. Now the transition must bring them into one umbrella. To have enough energy in wounded society to move on in future. So my conclusion is that Ukrainian society has not simply become more united or more fragmented. It has undergone a contradictory wartime recomposition in which cohesion and fragmentation have deepened at the same time. So again, just to recall, we have demographic loss, labor scarcity, territorial reordering, and new class dynamics, or even strata dynamics. Horizontal solidarity persists, but resource-dependent and stratified, and vertical solidarity deficit grows. Warm country versus cold state, difference is there, and sacrifice exists with institutional mistrust. So new moral hierarchy built on sacrifice and usefulness to the common case during war, and corruption morally delegitimized with unusual force. So if you are corrupt during war, you are even bigger enemy than it was ever before. And finally, post-war peace, the future after war, is still very murky. It's almost inaccessible, but it will be the second transition. So we will have to deal with managing memory about injustices of war, with managing inequality and divergent wartime biographies, again back in one society. Thank you very much. I will finish with this.
Very, very much for this in-depth analysis, explanation to our students that are political science students, but I think they had really a special occasion to have this at length and so detailed and profound analysis of Ukrainian society nowadays. I'm very thankful to you, Mykhailo, for this. I have many questions, but I guess I will leave to the floor to people who want to ask questions. And as I said, you can ask them in Italian. Don't be afraid, non abbiate paura. If you want to ask, you can ask in Italian.
So I will be going to you and giving you the microphone. Just raise your hand up. Just to start, while you are thinking about your questions, we just have created some. The first...
One by one, please.
Yeah, sure. So from the perspective of post-colonial studies, this division between warm country, cold state, like previously, used to result from the policies of the empires ruling over Ukrainian territories and pursuing their own interests rather than the interest of local population. And what do you think, is this division, the new one, kind of a memory of that old one, or it is created just due to the motivation that is war-related?
Well, we have a complex picture. If you apply post-colonial model for analysis, then you will see decolonization and recolonization at the same time. Recolonization is connected to the influence of political centers from outside Ukraine. And, well, for several years I had a philosophical seminar with frontline soldiers. We started with philosophy. There were several students of mine who were in 22 in frontline groups. And they were saying that they are becoming stupid, that they were losing in the war something important, and they wanted to return to normality within, not normality of war. So they asked me, let's have these online Zoom-based seminars, like 30 minutes, 40 minutes once a week. I was doing it a little bit with them, reading Nietzsche or Schopenhauer. I thought that would be a cure. You know, there's even a novel, Schopenhauer, as a remedy. No, they wanted something else. We read Skovoroda, we read some other schools, and then we moved to poetry. Poetry was kind of returning to the self, back to normality. It finished, but at a certain moment in these conversations you could hear that the soldiers or junior officers would say, oh, we're not sure we're fighting for Ukraine. And this was saying, oh, someone else's case? Of course it's not. They are definitely fighting for Ukraine. No doubt in that. But decisions are made more and more outside Ukraine, and resources provided. So you will see definitely element of recolonization. There's decolonization, decoupling of two big cultures, which creates a lot of internal wounds for Ukrainian society as well. In Odessa, in Zaporizhia, in Dnipropetrovsk, and so on. So this is very good model for analysis, but it shows abyss of what's going on, and very difficult. There's no one answer to this.
So when you say recolonization, you mean the dependence on foreign aid, I mean military help, or just also foreign balances in geopolitical sense?
Well, if I analyze, again, it's going to be analysis of outsider. I was asking it to my interlocutors, and they say continuation of war or decision of war decision of May 22 was not in the interest of Ukraine. So Istanbul Accords as more Ukrainian case. I may disagree, but this is the voice from there.
So sorry, this is May 22?
The decision to continue war.
That's for the end of the peace
talks. Yes. Again,
I see.
Knowing many facts, I have doubts they were kind of possible, like the reality, but it's a different discussion.
Yeah.
Here is important to understand that decision making and the structural decision making is not entirely in Kiev. If it's the case, they use Novaya Kolonialist, for example, two interviews were using it. Again, it's not majority of interviews, but still this vision is there. Again, decolonization definitely is better discussed and voiced, and we see it. But again, that's the equilibrium that I hear and complex picture that I hear from interviews.
Thank you. So questions? Yeah.
Thank you. If you see me look at the phone, it's because I wrote my question because I must improve my English. So.
Sure, don't worry.
I would like to link this slide to the DIA app.
Sorry, what is it?
I would like to link these slides to the DIA app.
Yes, DIA app, okay. DIA is the state e-services application.
Okay, sorry.
So, since the slide talk about a cold state and a new moral hierarchies, is there a risk that this app will become an automatic tribunal? Because
okay, good question.
If an algorithm crosses our data to decide who must fight or who can work, is not a state control too?
Well, as long as I could understand this, so far there's digital services provided to Ukrainians. To some extent they work fine. Others complain that it's not entirely effective. I do not have my personal experience of using it. However, you can definitely see that government and bureaucracy, having this experience from IT, as IT specialists, they believe more and more in it. Will there be tribunal based on court decisions, justice process, using app? I'm not sure. So during a Europeanization process between 2014-22, under the influence of EU, there were many progressive steps made. But however, we also got a new branch of power. So your political science students, which are usual three branches of power? Executive, legislative, judicial. In Ukraine, and I don't know what's going to be in future, but in Ukraine we have definitely new branch, which is anti-corruption branch. if you look at the budget, at institutions, at political creativity invested in pre-war Ukraine between 14 and 22, this is the branch of power that was created that controlled all bureaucracy, part of politicians and judges. This is why all bureaucracy didn't want to stay in their position. Over transparency that created also risks for their families and so on. And but during this process, we had access, free access to all databases of criminal cases. For me as a scholar, it was very interesting to go there, to control it. But with every year of war, more and more databases of this kind were closed. Or e-assets declarations, that's part of this new branch of power. When every politically exposed person and bureaucrat would have to annually describe his or her income. So for anti-corruption activists or analysts, that was a treasure. However, if you look how many decisions in court were made, you will see minimum. Only if you are from a lower bureaucracy, then maybe you will be punished. But if you are a political philosopher, you will go there and see what means richness. So what kind of assets do people keep in Ukraine if they are rich or powerful? Golden icons. Cash at home. So it says something about trust in banking system. Or something else. You literally see new forms of capital accumulation, which also kind of describes roles in a society. So if you are following this Marxian, post-Marxian political economy, you could use this database now, less accessible, in order to understand what is going on. And now we have a privileged class whose reports are not included. So if you are really successful bureaucrat or politician, you will end up in the group invisible for corruption, anti-corruption. External assessment. From within it still works. Then, now with this background application or artificial intelligence that could be used for governance or judiciary processes in future, it could work, but not in our case. Complexity of situation, traumas, the clashes, the new divisions cannot be apprehended by even very sophisticated matrices. So this transition and justice I'm talking about is social justice and social cure. So some treatment, some therapy will be needed for the society. And how shall it be? I don't know. Italy didn't show much depth. Fascists and anti-fascists, partigiani lived in the same society. And those of you who grew up and went through schooling in Italy, you know well that fascist role in Italy's history was kind of hidden. Maybe in previous generations, but from what I know from my Italian friends and relatives. So I don't know, where shall we look for examples? Italy or Germany, for example? That is a totally different approach.
That's interesting, yeah. Can I just quickly ask a question when you were saying that it was interesting when you made this comparison to when you grew up in Soviet Ukraine, that so that there was this idea that to be rich, or there was this Soviet middle class, so you didn't have to show either you're being rich or you're being poor. And this shift in the 90s of this to reinvent what is rich and what is poor, I'm interested in this aspect of the fact that, and you at some point said that there was inequality as a value, you said, or inequality was a value. So, because we know so little, at least not much, or from what we read from post-Soviet society, not as a specialist of Eastern Europe, is this idea that, so this probably very simplified idea that corruption is such a big thing, or was such a big thing in post-Soviet countries, but probably was such a big thing even in Soviet countries itself. So corruption as a way of surviving to some extent. So I was wondering, because I mean, we are the least country who can speak about corruption because we're quite a corrupted country ourselves. But I would like, is there something else that you can tell us about the centrality, the crucial role of corruption in this, from Soviet to post-Soviet?
You know, in political science and political theory, the group I belong to, we rarely use the word corruption.
Yeah.
We use paternalism,
Yeah.
which shows that unites political economy, political science together. So, in a nutshell, what corruption is the use of public posts for private gain. If we go back to Arendtian analysis or Habermasian analysis, what corruption would be? So we have two spheres, public and private, and there's a clear cut between them. So public institutions have their own logic and legitimacy, and we in private life have our own logic and legitimacy. When we cross this border, this is where corruption starts. So corruption, when I, as a judge, take a bribe, so I enrich my family and myself by misjudging, so corrupting political structure, the justice structure. But also when populist uses emotions in order to get into power positions, so uses religious effects or family values and so on, something from private life in order to gain public posts, it's also corruption. It's also misuse of this logic and crossing illegally, legitimately the border. So corruption. Now, when we look at Soviet structure, of course the level of bribery or enrichment, illegal enrichment, was structurally smaller, much smaller than in post-Soviet countries. But Soviet Union did not have this clear-cut public and private. In totalitarian period and in post-totalitarian period, it simply didn't exist, because public structures took over everything in private life. Again, let's recall what private sphere is belonging to: family, intimacy, sexual life, religious life, and of course greed. Well, lust, greed, trust of personal kind. So business doesn't exist, private entrepreneurship doesn't exist, so greed is excluded or minimalized. Sexual life, yes, Bolsheviks had sexual revolution in the beginning, but then with Stalin it became super conservative society. With sexual life, when we were teenagers, we simply didn't have place to make sex, first sex. In Soviet Union, the scarcity of private life was huge. So it's part of this game. Religious life, destroyed. Churches either don't exist or under full control of totalitarian institutions, and so on and so on. So basically you have lack of understanding or instinct that this line between private and public exists. And then, out of nothing, so late Soviet man tries to create free state, free politics, pluralism of ideologies, economy that makes you rich or poor, new nationality, nationhood, statehood, and so on, out of nothing, without having first-hand experience what means freedom in economy or in in politics. And again, Arendtian analysis here would work very much. When she tried to explain in some way what totalitarianism is when your personal experience does not equate to public life and rhetorics at all. So it's even more than double think or double speak. Here we enter 90s when we try to build, again, public and private institutions. This is why in my book about post-Soviet men, it says we have unprecedented revolutionary moment because we had revolutions in private and public life. So my generation went through sexual revolution, religious revolution, entrepreneurial revolution. So this is private sphere. And then we have revolution in politics. We create free, independent nations, national statehoods. We have courts with competing sides, and so on and so on. And then you see, while creating new constitutions and new republics, we divide supreme power of the communist party into branches, and then levels, local government, central government. However, the instincts of trust, so if you want to have success, economic or safety, or in politics, you create a number of private, personalized networks. And these networks, you have a little bit of judges, a little bit of ministers, a little bit of MPs, a little bit of mayors, a little bit of mafia bosses, journalists or editors-in-chief, and then your clan ruins the very idea of division of power and destroys the logic of republic. So it creates this corruption as one of the outcomes, but it creates much more. Inability for a republic to exist, impossibility of constitution and constitutional division of power. So this is patronal politics, and Henry Hale, who studied all the post-communist countries and shows how the patronal works after communism has fallen, is a very good book. Or Magyar and Madlovic, who are Hungarian scholars, they show how within EU this logic works. Hungary is one of the examples that they studied. Will Hungary be cured from what happened under Orban? I don't know, but we will see. There's definitely a healthy step ahead. Society wants difference, but what will happen? Will patronal politics be ruined? So this, when we talk about corruption, let's remember that it's one of the words, it's one of the effects, but political economy is quite more sophisticated.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. I would like to ask you your opinion. I would like to hear it on the organization of a new parliamentary election in Ukraine. Because I have heard some points of view from one side. There are some people who say it's almost impossible because a big part of the country is occupied, a lot of people are foreign, the population is mostly masculine because women can travel, as you said, the population is older also. No one can provide the security during the physical vote, also during the counts. But from another point of view, you know, I recently saw an interview of ex-foreign minister of Ukraine who was in charge during when the war started, Dmytro Kuleba, I think.
Kuleba.
And he said that the new election, parliamentary election, are needed because there are some, for example, veterans who might represent a new society today. So he pointed to another question that is discussable, like are the people who were elected 7 years ago, because you hadn't election for 7 years, so are the people elected 7 years ago still representing a new grew-up society in Ukraine?
Okay, well,
so my opinion is not to organize the election because I totally understand their situation. But just your opinion as such a law. Thank you.
Okay, once again, let's see the big picture. Why do we need parliament? Two reasons. First, to have representatives of Ukrainian people in decision making, and second, create legislation. When Ukrainian state was created in 1991-1992, founding mothers and fathers of Ukrainian Republic knew that there will be this tendency to concentrate power, dictatorial power in one hands. They knew their society, they knew the culture, political culture. So the constitution had inbuilt system of norms against concentration of dictatorial powers. This is why parliament cannot be elected during war. And it makes sense, and not because of insecurity for voters or counting commissions. Counting commissions can sit underground and count the votes. The problem is that there are restrictions for public debate right now. So you cannot elect your representative if you do not have competition between the parties, no open discussion. You cannot have proper representative in parliament if this is not in place. There is no competition of parties. They minimize their political struggle. Their programs are non-existent. New leadership is waiting to come in parliament, but more pressing, we need probably a new head of state. And if Ukrainian constitution denies the right for elections of parliament, president can be elected during war. There are two clauses in Ukrainian law of martial law and in Ukrainian code of elections, where the norm prohibits the elections of president under the war. But in our case, this can be changed. Laws can be changed during war, constitution cannot. So parliament is unusually long, but it still represents all Ukrainian portions and factions. And with president, we can actually test the new leadership that emerges from military, from volunteers, from other groups, and that would be the case. But again, it's also complicated. It is very difficult to elect a president as well, because this president will sign the peace treaty, not the old one. And this is the election of someone who has to be as heroic and to take responsibility to be hated for signing the future peace deal.
When you say this president, you mean a new...
Well, exactly, the elected, if elections will...
If election will take place.
And when Mr. Kuleba says something, it's definitely like, when he was minister, he was saying totally different things. When he was ambassador, he was saying totally different things. As official who is not politician, he's not politician, he's not a political leader, he's bureaucrat. Yeah. So he is in a specific position and he voices certain groups of bureaucracy. But it's much more important to hear what political groups think, how they channel the social pressure into debate. This is the role of political groups, of politicians who need public discussion, who need to come to a common decision. And again, the new president will be the one who will sign. Or it will be some general, brave, but without legitimacy, without the right. And then the peace deal, whichever it will be, will always be questionable and vulnerable, which is a huge loss. So you touch the nerve of the future perfectly, and there's no clear-cut answer to this.
If I may, I just a few days ago I was listening to the interview of Jaroslav Hrca, and he...
Jaroslav Hrca.
Hrca, the historian.
Right, famous Ukrainian American historian, let's say. And he said that maybe, because there will be a request from the Society of Representation of Military, as you said, and other things, but the question is if there will be a team around that person that can lead the society in a way, because like whether we like it or not, but this president, he has a team, like, but we know cases like Yushchenko who didn't really have a team. Yeah, so sorry. And Diana has a question.
Yeah, I would like also to ask a question about solidarity and in particular on the role of the diaspora. So how the diaspora movements developed during these last years of the war, and what were their main strengths or weaknesses also in the solidarity movement, and how is the diaspora seen in Ukraine? Thank you.
Well, I didn't have a specific question about this, but when we see these divisions, stayers and migrants, that is part of the issue. There's old diaspora, so those who went before 2014, let's say, before 91, and those who left after 22. These are two different diasporas in a way, and they are seen differently in these interviews. However, I would say that there's still this long network of solidarity, and all those who are outside of Ukraine and support Ukraine are important. They're important economically by still providing resources that Ukrainians in Ukraine cannot provide anymore or provide less. But there's also the political pressure that Ukrainians living abroad create on European societies, for example. That's there. But there's also this Ukrainian diaspora in Russia that pressures Russia, Putin, and so on in a way which is more bellicose, more militarized, and so on. So if you really map diasporas, you see that they value, they matter, and they matter differently. If you look again at the peace talks and possible transition, one of the projects that Putin Moscow promotes, and I'm not sure if Washington is not that supportive to this, that Ukrainians and Russia will vote in future also. This project is there, and this argument is there. So future brings a lot of very tough decisions. And diaspora, very diverse diaspora that we have, can have an influence, but it's still limited. Living abroad, I myself feel that I'm diaspora, you probably. How far and how much can we translate our ideas, interests through political groups in Ukraine into decision making? Probably not right now. So there's a limitation. We can provide economic resource, but not political directly. But through voting in Italy, through voting in Germany or England, there's still some kind of political influence as well.
Thank you. Other questions?
I just want to make a comment on this, but also on the things that you were saying about transition, because I agree and I perceive that transition will be a problem to some extent, and this risk of radicalization that you were referring to. But I think it's not just a matter of risk and transition problem for Ukraine, it's a risk also for Europe. It's a chance that Europe needs to take to some extent, and I wouldn't limit the discourse to Ukraine or Ukrainian diaspora, but it sort of has to do with all of us and Europe and the political wisdom or unwisdom of Europe in all of this, because that is really crucial. I think that is really crucial. Yeah, and so one Arendtian theme that I always try to bring up with the students is how important it is to have a political imagination, a political perspective, and not that everything is just reduced to economy, because the economy is the language, is the most familiar language, and politics seems to be always in the in the background, as if it didn't matter, whereas in these instances matters very much, a lot.
So, if I may ask, like, on the one hand, war in general is, like, it is known for moving society towards more patriarchal view on things, on social issues. But on the other hand, in contemporary Ukraine, we do have some examples of very active female activism, like Hanna Gvozdar, ex-CEO of Pratula Foundation, which is one of the biggest one, or Olivia Guaraldo, the CEO and co-founder of Superhumans Ukraine. So, and also there is a rather high percentage of women involved directly into military, active military. So how do you think from the gender equality perspective this war affects Ukraine?
Well, yes, there's a growing role of women right now during war. My daughter went to serve in army in 22 or so. She was a soldier. But protracted war spreads very conservative values in society. And lack of children will definitely promote very masculinized response, I would expect. There's higher probability of, like, let's make children after the war. So I think it's contradictory. Women in the war definitely make difference. They increase the resistance, direct frontline resistance including. But the longer war goes on, there's this paradox. The longer war goes on, the more conservative values have a chance to spread. And then returning to the issue of political imagination, it's very important. I was really shocked to hear this repetitive answer. We can simply talk about future, not even imagine it when the war ends. So can you imagine how limited is political imagination right now? There's a deficit of it. And that means that Ukrainian transition that I'm trying to talk right now, and some other thinkers in Ukraine try to do, it's still very kind of limited. Imagination, political, social imagination doesn't work in one hand. It's a shared vision. And so far this sharedness is an issue. It's really limited. There's another thinker, Ulrich Gumbrecht, who also talks a lot about art. He wrote a book about big present time. He analyzed non-war societies, but he shows that postmodern societies already have a deficit of future. And I agree. This late capitalism, exhausted future. And what we see in Ukraine is a radical case. It's, again, it's laboratory of history, laboratory of future with a lack of imagination what this future can be.
Yeah, yesterday we were discussing discussing Israel and Palestine with another expert, and yeah, I was just bringing the example of the radical criticism of war that female thinkers like Simone Weil did during the Second World War, and the idea that war, she says, like going back to the War of Troy, she says, Simone Weil says, you know, Helen of Troy was just a symbol for nothing. It was, they had to give a name to a war that has no meaning, because war never has any meaning. And war is just, the greatness of a war is measured on the number of corpses it produces. So that's a radical perspective of a philosopher, a woman philosopher in 1939. And so I was saying that we need political imagination also to go beyond this matrix of war that we used to think about when we think about politics, because there's always, it seems, even when we had COVID, the immediate metaphors were all bellicose metaphors, the war against the virus. It seems that we are unable to exit this this matrix of war in order to think about our coexistence. So that is really, I think, a lack of political imagination and an extremely masculine way of having dominated the political, you know. So one of the good reasons one could say, why should they just step aside and at least try to have women, is that the way that they have reduced the world in terms of war right now is just tremendous. This was just because of course also Israel and Palestine, this continuous reinstantiation of war and violence in response to violence. So this continuous circularity of violence seems to produce nothing but corpses, basically. So we have our consigliere Giacomo Cona, who has arrived. Vuoi dire qualcosa, Giacomo?
Se le serve?
Ah, ecco, guarda che abbiamo...
Italiano o inglese?
Sì, come vuoi, lui parla anche italiano.
First of all, thank you, Professor Minakov, thank you very much. Just a quick, just a few words. Maybe it's better to speak at the end of our conversation, because I can thank you even more for the interesting things and the interesting contents that you brought to us. And this is the third, I guess, event of the Art Center in the Verona Europa Festival.
No, yes, it's the third, and then we have a fourth one on next week. Yeah.
And yes, and it's always a pleasure to be here at the Verona University, to be here to speak about what happens in our world and what happens to Europe, what happens to Ukraine. And this is a very sensible theme also for the city of Verona. We have a very strong community of Ukrainian people here, and we also have a role as a municipality, because we are participating to the Rebuilding Ukraine platform with the government and with the Ukrainian government too, of course. So I think it's very important what you did today and what you brought today. Thank you again, and I wait for you for all the students here to the fourth event of the festival and the other events that we have. Thank you.
Grazie dell'invito. Attenzione.
Possiamo Ok, caricherò allora questo PowerPoint sul Moodle del laboratorio e vi ricordo i due libri che ha scritto importanti, From the Servant to the Leader, quindi è